What's up, my nerds? So in this video we are going to talk about how the heart rate is, or how the cardiac output is going to be regulated during exercise. Okay, so how is the heart rate increased or decreased according to the activity levels of the body, in particular the skeletal muscles, which will be involved in the exercise. Okay, so eventually we'll get to the point where we talk about the regulation of the heart rate in terms of how that's controlled by the cardiovascular control center of the central nervous system. But we'll begin by first reminding ourselves about what the heart does, how its function is related to, or how its function allows the muscles to work during exercise, and then we'll talk about how exercise impacts back on how the heart is working. Okay, so let's begin with the heart. Okay, so remember the heart's main function is to pump the blood. Okay, and so we need to remind ourselves that deoxygenated blood enters the right atrium, and when the atria contract during atrial systole, then that deoxygenated blood enters the right ventricle. When the ventricles contract and we go through ventricular systole, at that time the deoxygenated blood is being pumped out of the heart towards the lungs in the pulmonary artery. While that is all going on there, on the other side, oxygenated blood is returning from the lungs to the heart into the left atria. When the atria goes through the atrial systole, that oxygenated blood is moved into the left ventricle, and when the left ventricle contracts, then the oxygenated blood is pumped out through the aorta to the different parts of the body. And remember why that was important. So let's look at our muscle as an example of any cell in the body. What are those cells doing? So in the case of the muscle, let's change the color here. So in the case of the muscle, remember it's going through muscle contraction. Remember that requires ATP for the sliding filament hypothesis. Okay, so in order for muscle contraction to occur, in order for the cycle of attachment of the myosin head to the actin fibers, detachment, in order for that to happen, you need ATP. And ATP is provided by the process of respiration. Okay? And in the long term or the short term, respiration ultimately requires oxygen. So directly via aerobic respiration, but even indirectly, even if muscles undergo anaerobic respiration, ultimately oxygen has to be supplied in order to break down the lactic acid. So in order for respiration to occur in these muscles, in order for the muscles to be able to do what they're doing, carry out their function of muscle contraction, they need oxygenated blood, because oxygen is required for respiration. So this is the kind of thought process. Okay, this is the process, this is the reason why we need the heart to do what it's doing, to constantly be pumping out the oxygenated blood, receiving the deoxygenated blood. That's kind of a different story. Pumping out the blood which contains oxygen, high concentration of oxygen, so moving it great distances through the body, through the blood vessels. Okay, and the blood vessels then, so the blood is moving by mass flow, containing blood at with a high concentration of oxygen, and then when that blood arrives at cells, remember the cells are using up the oxygen and they are producing CO2. Okay, so because the heart is doing what it's doing, then the blood vessels are able to carry oxygenated blood, or at least the arteries are carrying oxygenated blood to the cells which are carrying out respiration, providing a high, blood with a high concentration of oxygen so that it can diffuse into the cells that require it at a high enough rate as per its requirements. And the carbon dioxide, that is being produced at high concentrations, okay, that is then being carried again via the blood vessels, now the veins. So maybe another one of those. Okay, but now this time it's carrying deoxygenated blood and now back to the heart for the cycle to repeat. So I hope we've established that in order for cells, including muscles, in order for them to be able to carry out their function, what needs to happen is that they need to be supplied with blood that contains a high concentration of oxygen. Now, the way the blood travels to those cells is via mass flow. But when that blood arrives at the cells, when the fluid that contains the oxygen arrives at the cells, at that point, because it's got a high concentration of oxygen, there can be a high rate of diffusion into the cells. The cells can then carry out respiration. They can produce ATP. In the case of muscle cells, that ATP can be used for muscle contraction. Okay? But respiration produces carbon dioxide, and there's a high concentration of carbon dioxide here. It will diffuse into the capillaries, which will eventually become join up to form the venules and veins, and the veins will then transport that blood under low pressure, this time back to the heart for the cycle to repeat itself. So I hope with that we understand the relationship between the heart, the blood vessels, and the cells that they supply, including muscles. Okay, now what we have to then look at is, if we're going to look at the regulation of the heart, we then need to look at now that if there was a lot of activity going on, if these muscles were being stimulated a lot in order to contract, how would that result in a change in activity of the heart? Because it would have to change in order to respond to the demands of the muscle cell. Okay, so let's go through that process. So if exercise increases, what's increasing is muscle contraction. So the process of muscle contraction is occurring more and more. If someone is running, the muscles in the arms and the legs are working more, and so more muscle contraction is occurring. Now, if more muscle contraction is occurring, then in order to allow that to happen, we need more ATP being generated. If we want more ATP to be generated, we need more respiration. Now, if more respiration is occurring, what's happening is that more CO2 is being generated. Okay, so more oxygen is being consumed, more CO2 is being generated. So more respiration means more CO2 being generated. Now, CO2 diffuses into the blood plasma, and there becomes dissolves, and some of it will react with the water and become carbonic acid. Okay, so what happens is, because of that, the pH levels of the blood plasma decrease. Okay, so decreased pH We can just remind ourselves that's increased acidity. Okay, so the blood plasma becomes more acidic, the pH levels go down. Okay, and at this point, this is when the heart activity needs to respond to this, because this situation can't be allowed to continue. Okay, the pH levels in the blood can't continue to decrease, because remember, the thing about the pH is it is going to affect proteins, including enzymes, in the body and in the cells. So you can't allow the blood pH to go too low, because if it does, then this is going to start to affect the proteins and the enzymes of cells and tissues, and it might affect their shape, and in that case it's going to affect their function, and then they'll stop working properly, these proteins, and when that happens, then you're going to start to affect the functions of tissues and organs of the body. So it's very important to make sure that this pH is not allowed to go too low. At the same time, we want to ensure that as muscle contraction is increasing, not only are we making sure that we're not allowing the CO2 levels to build up and cause potential damage or loss of function to cells and organs via loss of function of proteins, we also want to ensure that we're continuing the supply of oxygen. We're increasing, in fact, the supply of oxygen to meet the demands of the increased respiration, to provide more ATP, to allow the cells to continue the muscle contraction at the rate that is required for whatever activity is going on. Okay, so what is the connection between what's happening here and how the heart is going to change, or how the heart's activity is going to change? We'll discuss that next. Okay, so we have this increased activity of the muscles that is occurring because exercise has increased. And so, how is it that the heart's activity is going to change in response to that? Okay, now we need to remind ourselves of this idea, negative feedback, this idea of how the body regulates itself and makes responses to its environment. Okay, so one of the key ideas in this kind of concept is this idea that, the body is able to respond to things. Okay, this idea that the body has sensors. Okay, and those sensors can relay messages or information to control centers. Okay, and these are usually part of the central nervous system or brain. Okay, and that the control centers can then relay information, messages again to parts of the body that act as effectors, and when the effectors are stimulated, then we make a response to whatever the stimulus was. So you have a stimulus, something changes, the change is detected by parts of the body that act as sensors. The sensors relay messages to the control center. The control center then relays messages appropriately, so according to the information that it received, it will send accordingly to the right place in the body, to the right effectors. It will stimulate those, and when those effectors are stimulated, a response will be made. Now this is the key central idea, and the regulation of the heart in response to exercise is nothing different than that simple idea. So let's look at how that kind of plays out. So exercise is occurring, and we've discussed that as a response to the exercise occurring, if all other things remain the same, and more oxygen is being used up, then we might get a reduction in the blood oxygen levels. We'll get an increase in the blood CO2 levels. We'll get a decrease in the blood pH, okay, in response to exercise. So exercise should cause oxygen levels to decrease, CO2 levels to increase, pH levels to go down. Those changes are occurring because there's been a sudden increase in the exercise. Okay, now in the case of the cardiovascular kind of control system, in this case, the stimulus is going to be the CO2 levels, the oxygen levels, and the pH levels. The sensors are various groups of cells located in different blood vessels of the body and detecting the chemical composition, the pH of the blood constantly. Okay? Now, the way they communicate with each other is via neural connections. So these sensors will be connected to the control center. Now in this case, the control center is the cardiovascular control center in the medulla oblongata of the brain. Okay, so right here, medulla oblongata of brain. Right, so we've got our stimulus, we've got our sensors, groups of cells in the blood vessels detecting changes in the plasma of the blood as it moves past them, and they are constantly reporting to the medulla oblongata of the brain. And the way they do that is by sending impulses to the medulla via neurons. Okay, so these neurons allow the sensors to communicate with the control center. But then in order for the control center to make a response, the control center itself has to be connected to its effector. And the effector in this case is the heart. Okay, more specifically, the thing that regulates the heart, or the part of its structure that allows its rate to be regulated, is the sinoatrial node. Okay, so sensors connected to the control center connected to the effector, again via neurons. These ones are special and we'll discuss them. Okay, so that's one neuron, or one bundle of neurons. And that's another one. Okay, now this, for me, this makes sense because you need the system connected up in this way to allow the body, to allow the appropriate response to the stimulus. Okay, so we've got our stimulus, we've got our sensors that are detecting that stimulus. We've got now the sensors connected via neurons to the control center, the medulla oblongata of the brain, the cardiovascular control center of the medulla oblongata of the brain. And the medulla oblongata of the brain is then connected to the effector that's going to make an appropriate response. Okay, so let's see how that happens. Now, when the sensors detect the changes that go with the exercise, impulses are kind of passed on, or impulses, nerve impulses, move down these neurons towards the cardiovascular control center of the brain. When those impulses are received, then the appropriate response is made. Now, when the impulses are relaying the information that there's more exercise happening, then the response has to be to increase the rate of the heart. Now, what happens then? What happens, or how that happens, is that the control center has to be able to increase the heart rate and decrease the heart rate. So we recall that the SAN, it's essentially the pacemaker of the heart. And in a different video, I have discussed how the SAN regulates the events of the heartbeat, the cardiac cycle, so you might want to check that out. But assuming that the SAN is what you need to control in order to control the rate of the whole heart, then the cardiovascular control center only needs to be able to control this in order to control the rate of beats of the heart. Now, how it does that is this. So these two bundles of nerves or neurons are, one is an acceleratory bundle and the other one is kind of deceleratory. Okay, so the acceleratory one is called the sympathetic neuron, okay, or the sympathetic nerve. So when the cardiovascular control center is receiving impulses or information that the CO2 levels, that more exercise is happening, it sends impulses down the sympathetic nerve in order to increase the rate of the SAN. When exercise then stops and then the CO2 levels are going down, the oxygen levels are going up, and the pH levels are going up, in that case, if the medulla oblongata was getting that information, then it would send impulses out via the parasympathetic nerve in order to decrease the rate that the SAN is sending out impulses to contract the heart. Okay, so how is that? Now, when the impulse moves down one of these two nerves, at the end of those nerves, they release neurotransmitter, and it's the neurotransmitter that actually affects the cells of the SAN, causing the SAN to either increase its rate or reduce its rate. Okay? Now, the sympathetic nerve releases the neurotransmitter noradrenaline. Okay? So the sympathetic, if an impulse moves down the sympathetic nerve, then the neurotransmitter that it releases is noradrenaline, and noradrenaline increases the rate of the sinoatrial node. And then when the sinoatrial node has increased its rate, then the heart is beating more often, the cardiac output is increasing, more blood is moving by mass flow, so there's a greater supply of oxygen, and then you can carry out a higher rate of respiration, more ATP produced, more muscle contraction. Okay? However, if the medulla oblongata got different information, like the CO2 levels have gone down, the oxygen levels are going up, the pH is going up, we need a lower heart rate now, in that case, impulses would move down the parasympathetic neuron, and the parasympathetic neuron, when the impulse reaches the end of that neuron, the neurotransmitter released by the parasympathetic is acetylcholine. Okay, so noradrenaline, sympathetic, acetylcholine, parasympathetic. Okay, and then the heart rate would go down. Okay, so I hope that this is now making sense. Remember, this central concept of stimulus, sensor, control center, and effector is important, and it repeats multiple times. There's many different examples of that in the A-level biology course. Okay, so I hope that has helped make sense of things. If you have any questions, do put them down in the comment section, and good luck.